Shalom. We're going to keep going as we continue to look at leadership in the Most High's kingdom. We're going to look at two other individuals, Daniel Payne and Henry McNeil Turner. So we'll go ahead and start. All right, Daniel Alexander Payne. He was born in 1811 and died in 1893. He was an American bishop, an educator, a college administrator, and an author. He was a major shaper of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He stressed education and preparation of ministers and introduced more order in the church, becoming its sixth bishop and serving for more than 4 decades. Actually, he served till he died, as well as becoming one of the founders of Wilberforce University in Ohio in 1856. In 1863, the AME Church bought the college and chose Payne to lead it. He became the first African American president of a college in the United States and served in that position until 1877. By quickly organizing AME missionary support of freemen in the South after the Civil War, Payne gained 250,000 new members for the AME Church during the Reconstruction era. Based first in Charleston, he and his missionaries founded AME congregations in the South, down the East Coast to Florida, and west to Texas. In 1891, Payne wrote the first history of the AME Church, a few years after publishing his memoir. He was born free in Charleston, South Carolina, on February 24, 1811, of African, European, and Native American descent. Daniel stated later in his autobiographical writings, as far as memory serves me, my mother was of light brown complexion, of middle stature and delicate frame. She told me that her grandmother was of the tribe of Indians known in the early history of the Carolinas as the Catawba Indians. He also stated that he descended from the Goins family, who were a well-known free colored/Native American family. His father was one of 6 brothers who served in the American Revolutionary War, and his paternal grandfather was an Englishman. His parents, London and Martha Payne, were part of the brown elite of free blacks in the coastal southern city. Both died before he reached maturity. While his great aunt assumed Daniel's care, the Miners' Moralist Society assisted his early education. Payne was raised in the Methodist Church like his parents. He also studied at home, teaching himself mathematics, physical science, and the classical languages. In 1829, at the age of 18, he opened his first school in Charleston. After the infamous and feared Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831, in Virginia, South Carolina, and other southern states passed legislation further restricting the rights and movement of free people of color and slaves. They enacted a law several years after the uprising on April 1st, 1835, which made teaching literacy to both free people of color and slaves illegal and subject to fines and imprisonment for both whites and blacks. With the passage of this law, Payne had to close his school. In May of 1835, he sailed from Charleston north to Philadelphia in search of further education, declining the Methodist offer, which was contingent on his going on a religious evangelist mission to the Republic of Liberia in West Africa, which was then being organized as a colony for free blacks and emancipated slaves from the United States. Payne instead studied at the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg, founded several years earlier in 1826. In Gettysburg, Adams County, in rural farming area of south central Pennsylvania. The Gettysburg Seminary, only a decade old, was the second Lutheran theological seminary in North America and the current oldest in American Lutheranism, with then only a small number of theology students in one 3-story building capped with cupola, later known as Old Dorm. I'm going to jump down. So after he graduated, Payne never was later called or served as a Lutheran minister, though he was the first to be educated and ordained in 1835 by an American Lutheran church body. One source claims he had to drop out of school because of problems with his eyesight. Another source claimed no congregation called him, and the leaders and ministers in the General Synod of the Lutheran Church told him to work through the Methodist Episcopal Church. He had 2 wives. Also, Payne married in 1847, but his wife died during the first year of marriage from complications of childbirth. As a parenthetically, this was very common at this particular point in time. When you begin to look at the biographies of many of the leaders in the Black community, male and female, you will see that most of them were married several times, and in many cases because their spouses had died early. So in this situation, Payne's first wife died from complications in childbirth, but also, if you remember, a couple of the other individuals that we have spoken about, tuberculosis was an issue. Basically, health issues also sent people to their graves earlier than they should have. So at least half of the cases, the individuals that we've been looking at have had either strained relations or because of slavery and being enslaved, they were separated from their parents, okay, in some fashion, or basically all of them had trauma. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. And yet it was the trauma that moved them into searching out a spiritual center. And so that's one of the common threads and themes also. There's more on his career in the AME Church. Basically the thing that called to your attention was the fact that in 1848, 4th Bishop William Paul Quinn named Payne as the historiographer of the AME Church. So he was heavily involved with the AME Church when it came to the educational piece. So a lot of the focus in the AME Church being on education was actually driven by gentlemen such as Bishop Payne. Okay. I'll just read a little bit more. Together with Reverend Lewis Woodson, a sympathetic white minister and AME member, and 2 other African Americans representing the AME, the founding board of directors, in which was later purchased Wilberforce University in Wilberforce, Ohio in 1856. Okay. So he did that in concert with another white minister who evidently was also in the AME church. Um, and then it goes on to say it was named for the now deeply revered William Wilberforce, who was a long-serving British political and social leader, firm abolitionist, and deep Christian believer in the gospel, who worked tirelessly for his anti-slavery and abolishing the African transatlantic slave trade causes for decades as a longtime member of the lower chamber of the British Parliament in the House of Commons. Among the trustees who supported the abolitionist cause and African American education was Salmon Chase, previous governor of Ohio, who was appointed Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court by President Abraham Lincoln and serving as U.S. Secretary of Treasury in Lincoln's cabinet for 3 years during the Civil War. The town of Wilberforce was located at what had been a popular summer resort called Tawawa Springs. It was patronized by people from Cincinnati further south on the Ohio River, including abolitionists as well as many white planters from the South who often brought their mistresses of color and natural, or what they call illegitimate, multiracial children with them for extended stays. So yeah, that's the main thing. It has a college named after him. Again, and it's called Payne Theological Seminary. And his main focus, again, being missions. Well, I'm going to read one other thing. The AME's first task was to improve the ministry, the second to improve the people. At a denominational meeting in Baltimore in 1842, Payne recommended a full program of study for ministers to include English grammar, arithmetic, ancient history, modern history, ecclesiastical history, and theology. At the following 1844 AME General Conference, he called for a regular course of study for prospective ordinees in the belief they would lift up their parishioners. In 1845, Pastor Payne tried to establish a short-lived AME seminary and succeeded in gradually raising the educational preparation required for its ministers. So that's what he was primarily known for, elevating the intellectual and the formal training that the ministers or those who would minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church would have. Now, there was a very important sentence here that I think the denomination needs to revisit. The whole purpose in doing that was so that the ministers would be equipped to elevate the people. It wasn't for people to be in ministry and elevate themselves. It was so that the quality of life of the population, called the lay organizations or the lay people in the church, would benefit from that same body of knowledge. And so that's why he thought that the training the ministers was so important. That is different than what it has morphed into, but certainly that was his purpose. So again, that was Daniel Payne, Bishop Payne, actually. We're going to do one more person, and that's Henry McNeil Turner. Henry McNeil Turner was an American minister. Well, first of all, he was born in 1834 and died in 1915. He was American minister, politician, 12th elected and consecrated bishop of the AME Church. After the Civil War, he worked to establish new AME congregations among African Americans in Georgia. He was born free in South Carolina, and he learned to read and write and became a Methodist preacher. He joined the AME Church in St. Louis, Missouri in 1858, where he became a minister. Founded by free blacks in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the 19th century, the AME Church was the first independent Black denomination in the United States. And then it goes on to say later, Turner had pastorates in Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. One of the characteristics of being a minister of the AME Church is the notion of an itinerant minister. In other words, they don't stay in the same place for long periods of time. The itinerant nature of the Wesleyan Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, was to send people to minister to congregations, but then to go on and minister to other congregations. So the continuity piece for an individual congregation was not dependent on the personality of the minister. So that's why where it says here that he had pastorates in Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., but he actually started out in St. Louis, Missouri. That's kind of normal for an AME minister. Well, actually for a Methodist minister in general. In 1863, during the American Civil War, he was appointed by the U.S. Army as the first African-American chaplain in the United States colored troops. After the war, he was appointed to the Freedmen's Bureau in Georgia. He settled in Macon and was elected to the state legislature in 1868 during the Reconstruction era. An AME missionary, he also planted churches, many churches, in Georgia after the war, which is what I was just talking about. So he went from place to place, but going from place to place, he was literally a missionary doing work and establishing churches, or what we call plant. Nowadays, I don't even think they use that terminology when Henry McNeil Turner was alive, but planting churches. In 1880, he was elected as the first Southern bishop of the AME Church after a fierce battle within the denomination because of its northern roots. Okay. I'm going to read this next paragraph. Angered by the Democrats regaining power and instituting Jim Crow laws in the late 19th century South, Turner began to support Black nationalism and immigration of Blacks to the African continent. This movement had started before the Civil War under the American Colonization Society. Turner was the chief figure in the late 19th century to support such immigration to Liberia. Most African American leaders of the time were pushing for rights in the United States. So Henry McNeil Turner was one of those individuals in, as it says, the late 19th century who was supporting Black nationalism. Under Marriage and Family, it says in 1856, Turner had married Eliza Peacher, daughter of a wealthy free Black contractor in Columbia, South Carolina. They had a total of 14 children, 4 of whom lived to adulthood. Eliza died in 1889, so they were married for a little over 30 years. The widower Turner married Martha Elizabeth DeWitt in 1893. After she died, he married Harriet A. Wayman in 1900. She also died in a few years. He married Laura Pearl Lemon in 1907. So he outlived 3 of his 4 wives. So again, that was relatively common, and death had a lot to do with it. Okay. Not infidelity, by the way. Okay. So I wanted to read one other section under political influence, because don't forget, he was a legislator in Georgia. Okay. In the post-war years, Turner became politically active with the Republican Party, whose officials had led the war effort, and under Abraham Lincoln, emancipated the slaves throughout the Confederacy. He helped found the Republican Party of Georgia. He ran for political office from Macon and was elected to the Georgia legislature legislature in 1868. At the time, the Democratic Party still controlled the legislature and refused to seat Turner and 26 other newly elected Black legislators, all Republicans. By the way, that same thing happened in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, almost a 100 years later, with Julian Bond in Georgia. So Georgia has a long history of nullification when it comes to intelligent Black officials wanting to make a difference in the society. There's always in Georgia been an effort to suppress those efforts. And in 2023, the same thing is happening again. Okay. So there is a history that Henry McNeil Turner was living through, and so I'm bringing that up because some people, when they're faced with those types of issues, just continue to beat their heads against brick walls. He chose a different route, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Well, we mentioned that they wouldn't seat him. After the federal government protested, the Democrats allowed Turner and his fellow legislators to take their seats during the second session. So it took government interference. And that is why the slave states to this day, and those who have a slave state mind to this day, always decry the imposition of the federal government into their affairs. So the whole notion of states' rights has to do with we need and want the right to make Black people do what we want them to do. And if that means to keep them out of the legislature, we need to have the right to do that as a state. And the federal government cannot overrule that right. This has been going on since the inception of the country, and certainly since after the official end to chattel slavery. Okay, so in 1869, Turner was appointed to the Republican administration as a postmaster of Macon, which was considered a political plum. He was dismayed after the Democrats regained power in the state, and throughout the South by the late 1870s, that's when Jim Crow laws began to manifest themselves. This was right after and actually toward the end of what has been called Reconstruction. So once the North withdrew from the South, and that there's a whole history behind that as well, as you may know, the mindset of the Southern planters, the Southern oligarchs, was to move things as quickly as possible back to where they were, where absolute authority and power over the Black community was again established and reestablished. In other words, is getting things back as closely as possible to Black people being enslaved. So all of that was happening. And so when you hear from Southern textbooks, the ones that these Southern governors want to have presented, what you hear about that is that during this period of time, legislators like Henry McNeil Turner were ignorant coons, and they were very uncouth people, which is why, and I might read a little bit of Henry McNeil Turner's writings so that you can see just how erudite he was. I'm going to read an excerpt from Henry McNeil Turner so that you can see in his own words the kind of individual that he was. This is an excerpt from a speech that he gave at the Chicago World's Fair. The speech is entitled "The African as a Tradesman and Mechanic," an address of Bishop H.M. Turner before the African Congress at the World's Fair in Chicago, August 15th, 1893. Ladies and gentlemen, in attempting to treat this subject briefly, I shall employ the term African as comprising all divisions of the African races or their descendants, whether living upon the continent of Africa or scattered over any portion of the globe. For as a fountain cannot rise above its source, so no portion of a people can rise above the intellectual powers of their primogenitors, however fortunate may be their environments. Man is an evolutionary being and not involuntary and not involutionary. Whatever greatness he may possess may be innate, aboriginal, belonging to the original stock. I would not attempt to question the potency of human imbibition or absorption. For that we are largely the creatures of circumstances is a fact too thoroughly settled to call for theory, speculation, or even logical deduction. That language, customs, manners, and education all enter to a greater or lesser degree into our makeup must be conceded by every sane person. The African or Negro races have been the subject of idealistic speculation for many generations, both in this country and in Europe, many styling them an inferior division of the human family, while others have contended that they are men holding a common rank with other divisions of mankind when circumstances conspire to impart the same caste and intellectual and moral advantages. I use the term African races because all Africans are not alike in every particular. Some Africans are intensely black, while others are brown, others olive color, others still may be classed as virtually yellow, while not possessing a drop of Caucasian blood in the manner that color is modified in this country. Size and feature differences between the Kru, Mandingo, Pesik, Vere, Jollof, Congo, Kafir, and Zulu tribes are too manifest in their varieties to call for discussion. Certainly, the variety is as clearly exhibited as the differences that exist between the English, Irish, French, Germans, Spanish, Russians, Italians, and other peoples that inhabit Europe and possess language and characteristics which specialize them respectively. So that's a snippet from this speech, but this is the introduction. In essence, this is a speech that is promoting the idea that the nation should not only recognize but embrace and employ the highly talented people that are found. So I'm just going to read down a little bit. Accepting the above as the voice of his history, it would appear that Black has figured prominently at a very early date. For the same Black Ethiopians, for all we can tell at this advanced period in the scale of progression, may have been the projectors and builders of what is generally called the Egyptian pyramid. For a number of learned men, as you are aware, have contended that the pyramids antedate the Egyptians. For all attempts to decipher such hieroglyphics as give date to the building of the pyramids are but little, if any, more than hypothecation. The drift of nature, whether interpreted speculatively or historically, would therefore appear to be whiteward. Primitive man, who doubtless has existed for ages longer than our chronology fixes it, in my opinion, was Black and is the father of the white races of the earth. And the same Black primitive man gave to the intermediate color or red Egyptian civilization learning, science, and philosophy, including skilled labor in its highest form. And this red race has transmitted to the white races letters, poetry, logic, mechanism, and all the fundamental fundamentalities that the white races have embellished, refined, and improved upon until it has reached the grandeur of this world-famed Chicago Exposition. And then he goes on to say the point that he is about to make is the plethora of contributions, intellectual and mechanically, made by people of African descent. Just a few more words. First, does the African possess the intellectual ability to construct and manufacture such buildings and necessary apparatus as are desired by civilization? My reply is that he does. Mechanical genius is the highest test of intellectuality because it involves meditation, prearrangement of device or plan, and such association of ideas and concerted execution as evolve and combine harmony, symmetry, and beauty. All these attainments, I maintain, the African possesses and will prove the assertion by presenting a list of names of persons known to the writer, many of whom are still living, which we think will be more satisfactory than any process of reasoning that could possibly be presented. For after all, ocular and auricular evidence is the most convincing species of testimony, and mankind prefers it, regardless of their culture and natural attainments. So this is about halfway through the speech. The rest of the speech just lists one name after another of the contributions made or among his cohorts that were from Georgia, starting out with Georgia, but also mentioning throughout the country scores and scores of individuals who have, in an unsung way, contributed to the quality of life of this place called the United States of America. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the type of person that Henry McNeil Turner was, and these are his words that I just read for you. So he was dismayed after the Democrats regained power in the state and throughout the South by the 1870s. He had seen the rise of violence at the polls, where Democrats had used intimidation and fraud to suppress Black voting. In 1883, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, forbidding racial discrimination in hotels, trains, and other public places, was unconstitutional. Turner was incensed. And then here's one of his a snippet of his writing. The world has never witnessed such barbarous laws entailed upon a free people as have grown out of the decision of the United States Supreme Court issued October 15th, 1883. For that decision alone authorized and now sustains all the unjust discriminations, proscriptions, and robberies perpetuated by public carriers upon millions of the nation's most loyal defenders. It fathers all the Jim Crow cars into which colored people are huddled and compelled to pay as much as the whites who are given the finest accommodations. It has made the ballot of the Black man a parody, his citizenship a nullity, and his freedom a burlesque. It has engendered the bitterest feeling between the whites and Blacks and resulted in the deaths of thousands who would have been living, enjoying life today. Those were the words of Henry McNeil Turner. So in late 19th century, Turner witnessed state legislatures in Georgia and across the South passing measures to disenfranchise Blacks, largely by raising barriers to voter registration. Does any of this sound familiar? He became a proponent of Black nationalism and began to support immigration of American Blacks to the African continent. Let me read that again. Because of what was happening across the South legislatively, see, we think that discrimination and persecution on the Black community is done by poor, ignorant whites. These people who were doing these things were the cream of white society. And it was those people that Turner was talking about. And so it goes on to say, again, I'll read this same paragraph. In the late 19th century, Turner witnessed state legislatures in Georgia and across the South passing measures to disenfranchise Blacks. Now, some Black people, some of the progeny of these people that were going through these things in the 50s and 60s were those who said, we don't want to do what Turner is suggesting here. So he became that proponent of Black nationalism because he saw there was no way for Black people to be treated as human beings in the South specifically, but in the nation in general. So his conclusion, the conclusion of an intelligent Black man, was we need to be somewhere else. And so he began to support the immigration of American Blacks to the African continent. He thought it was the only way they could make free and independent lives for themselves. When he traveled to Africa, he was struck by the differences in the attitude of Africans who ruled themselves and had never known the degradation of slavery. So Turner founded the International Migration Society, supported by his own newspapers. And so the Voice of Missions, I'll just mention again parenthetically, see, all of this is based on his spiritual journey. He was grounded in the word of the Most High, and it's from that grounding that he did what he did. Just as Bishop Payne saw the efficacy of education, Bishop Turner saw the efficacy of publications. Okay, a way for the community to inform itself and to keep itself appraised of things. So the Voice of Missions and later the Voice of the People were two of his newspapers. He organized 2 ships with a total of 500 or more immigrants who traveled to Liberia in 1895 and 1896. This was established as an American colony by the American Colonization Society before the Civil War and settled by free American Blacks. They tended to assume their superiority to indigenous Africans in the area and establish their own society, disliking the lack of economic opportunity, cultural shock, and widespread tropical diseases. Some of the migrants returned to the United States. After that, Turner did not organize another expedition. Now, the reason this is important for us to understand is he had the vision, okay, and he acted on the vision. His vision was very similar to what Revelation says, come out of Babylon. But the people that he was encouraging to do that did not have that same vision. And most of those people ended up saying, no, we can make a life for ourselves here in the States. And that's what the struggle has been since these days. So it's very similar. Now, this is some editorial commentary, I'm sorry, but it's very similar to what Joshua and Caleb experienced as 2 of those 12 spies that went and spied out the promised land. The land was overflowing with wealth and everything that the nation needed. But only 2 of those spies said, we can take that land. The other people said, no, we're scared of the people who are there. And so Henry McNeil Turner was in that minority of what we would call Black people in this country. And when I say what we would call Black people, more specifically, what we would call Black leadership in this country, which is why we're studying this, who made a determination that it was better to stay here. And so that's where we are today. But today, even as we speak, the very same spirit that was driving the South then and some of the states in the North, such as Ohio and Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, uh, Missouri, those same mentalities, that same spirit is being dealt with today. But the people who are the progeny of that ruling class and those who worked on behalf of the ruling class, the poor whites, the working class whites, their progeny are still doing today what they did, but they're better at it. So the sophistication of white supremacy is much deeper now than it was then when Henry McNeil Turner was living. We see that he got to Africa, and I want to show you one other thing. So, yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap this study up with the following comments. Whether we're talking about Daniel Payne, whether we're talking about Henry McNeil Turner, whether we're talking about Amanda Smith, whether we're talking about Richard Allen, all of them were leaders in the Most High's kingdom on earth, okay, and among the Most High's people. In each of those cases, there were some similarities that we want to look at. So as we begin to close out, let's look at some of those similarities. Okay. So godly leaders in Yasharel's 19th and 20th centuries. Godly leaders as it relates to us as his people being in the land of our captivity. So we're looking at Harriet Tubman. We're looking at Amanda Smith. We're looking at Daniel Alexander Payne and Henry McNeil Turner. I didn't put Richard Allen on the screen, but certainly he's one as well. But they have common traits. And so when it comes to leaders, occasionally need to remind ourselves that the Most High has standards for his leaders, which is why his leaders must be sold out completely to him. Okay. And each one of these people I would submit to you were, all right. They come from a variety of walks of life. Harriet Tubman and Amanda Smith were just average sisters, okay, with extraordinary work that they were able to accomplish. Daniel Alexander Payne and Henry McNeil Turner would be considered the cream of the crop when it comes to the African American community or the children of the Most High, excuse me, in these lands that we call the United States of America. So whether we're talking about your average person, the people who the society didn't care very much about, or whether you're talking about people who the society itself had to recognize for their outstanding character and leaders, all of those four people represent the best that we have. And that's why they're being looked at, because we have forgotten these people, with the exception of Harriet Tubman. We as a people group, in many cases, don't even know they existed, which means that we're cut off for our parts, just as Ezekiel 37 says. But in the Most High's kingdom, these people and what they did and what drove them to do what they did are examples for us as we go back and rebuild. Okay, so when we choose our leaders, first of all, we know that the biblical example of the leaders are found in the Tanakh, but they're also found in the New Testament, and we went through those in First Timothy. But the common traits of these leaders, all of them had a love for children as well as adults, and a love that translated itself into wanting to impart the educational expertise that they had to those people. So all of them were teachers. Okay, that's what we're talking about, and all of the teaching, all of the instruction is for the betterment and the raising of the standard of expectation of the entire society, which starts with the children. And as we know, that's why the individual parents were told to teach these things to your children, talking about Deuteronomy chapter 6. So godly leaders teach the adults so that the adults can teach the children. That's why the godly leaders should be pursuing, to the best of their ability, the highest aspirations for keeping themselves educated so that they can teach the adults how to take that same information and educate their children. But all of it is based on biblical principles. So those biblical principles start out with teach your children. And you can't teach your children if the adults don't know what to teach them. So you have to teach the adults. That's the job of the church, a key job of the church. The job of the church minister is to do this. This is your primary job. It's not to put butts in seats. It's not to make yourself of note among other people who've also been to seminary and gotten their masters or PhDs. And then you have this whole society that you create for yourselves. That's what the Pharisees did. The Father is not in that. The Father is in taking that knowledge base and bringing it as far into the society as we possibly can, because an informed society is a prosperous society. So the leaders have to take that position. If you have a leader doing that, the people underneath the leadership are also going to do it. If you have a leader not doing that, you have a people who will remain in a state of ignorance, and that's how they will act. So that's one of the common traits. Another one of the common traits is the desire to take care of the sick. Not even the desire, the unction to take care of the sick, and also the unction to take care of orphans. Both, well, this was one of the hallmarks of Amanda Smith, but all of these individuals made sure that those who had lost their parents or those who had become orphaned because of war would be taken care of. They saw those as precious souls, just as they saw the necessity to feed those who were hungry. And each one of those individuals then, in order to do those things above, had to advocate on behalf of those things to the larger society. So that's why you need people in the state legislatures. You need people in the school boardrooms. You need people in the federal government. You need statesmen who will advocate on behalf of your people. Those were common traits. All of these people were involved with politics. So for those of you who say politics doesn't matter, that's because you have been cut off from your parts and you don't understand. The Most High has something for all of us to do, and all of this is important. Okay. And then all of them would also seek out groups with similar vision. Don't forget Henry McNeil Turner's speech at the World's Fair, advocating for what we would call to be included in the bounty and the opportunities of this country. And what he did when making that case, he went down the list just in his own state of Georgia. He went down the list of all of the highly talented people. There were hundreds of them in the mid 1800s, and they were involved with mechanics. They and I'm not talking about fixing cars. I'm talking about the mechanics in the industrial age, making machines that would do what they needed them to do. They were involved in architecture. They were involved in bricklaying. They were involved in metalwork, all those kinds of things. People in Georgia, the ones that that those who were in the state legislature were trying to put back into slavery, had all these skills and all these skill sets. So he advocated for those people. So in doing so, that's how each one of these people in their own way would seek out groups who had at least a modicum of affinity for the desires of people of African descent to be able to live out their lives in a productive way. Okay. And of course, all of their focus was on missions. We didn't talk a lot about, or we didn't read a lot about how Henry McNeil Turner being one, but also Richard Allen, and to a certain extent, Daniel Payne. The way that the AME church expanded was through missions. Okay. And it wasn't just the women. Henry McNeil Turner was doing those kinds of things. Okay. The church plantings, that's what missions are. Okay. So in other words, you can't have a society if you don't have people who are connected with their creator. They understood that. Okay. So that's one of the common traits of a godly leader as well in Yasharel in the 19th and the 20th centuries. So that's where we'll stop. We may end up doing a little bit more on this as we continue through this calendar year. The focus on leadership is heavy so that the nation can be built on godly principles with godly people who will then reproduce themselves through the teaching, through the modeling, through the lived examples, so that those around them can see what the expectations are for them. Father, bless you and keep you. Father, make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Father, lift up his countenance upon you and give you his shalom.